Caught in the act again. Welcome to another Whisky Me live tasting. Sorry, I'm just drinking some Nc'nean to get to wet my whistle. Thank you for joining us this evening for this special live tasting. I'll allow you to all take your seats while everyone filters into the room. It's special because, in case you haven't been reading all of our social media and email literature, this month marks our 5th birthday here at Whisky Me, which is kind of cool, quite incredible. Something we started 5 years ago as a bit of a side hustle to our whiskey bars and other bars and so on, that has grown to be the biggest whiskey sampling club in the UK, and also obviously achieved Dragon's Den investment to give us a bit of public notoriety. And yeah, we're super excited to still be sending out whiskey and to have launched Nc'nean Me, of course, which we're sending the first patches of that out on Monday. And I was doing a little bit of back of fag packet maths and worked out that we've sent something like 250,000 pouches of whiskey over the last 5 years. And we've featured somewhere around 80 different distilleries during that time as well, about 60 of them from Scotland. Which is pretty cool. Anyway, it's exciting that it's our 5th birthday, and it's exciting that our Scottish single malt this month is Nc'nean. Not only because Nc'nean's delicious and it's got a great story and it's got great values, but also because the brand ambassador for Nc'nean is a man called Matt Hastings. And Matt has actually been on and done a tasting with us before for Nc'nean. It was on 2 years ago when we first featured Nc'nean. It was in fact the first release from that distillery that we featured 2 years ago. If you remember, then you might remember it. Matt's been working for them for I think about 2 or 3 years now. But in a past life and a past job, he used to work for Whisky Me. In fact, he used to run Whisky Me back in its earlier days. And so it's great we've got Matt joining us because it's our 5th birthday. And it gives us a bit of a chance before we get into tasting Nc'nean to have a little bit of a reminisce about the early days of Whisky Me, perhaps as we enjoy a little glass of Nc'nean and give you a little bit of insight into what it was like back then working for me and Tom. And also, I'm going to crack a very special pouch, which is this one here. You probably can't read it, but that is a pouch of the Macallan Fine Oak 12-year-old, which is the first whiskey we ever released at Whisky Me, and it has sat in that pouch for 5 years. I'm going to open it and see what it's tasting like. So I'm going to bring in Matt now, just so you can listen to someone else talk. Hello, Matt.
Hi, Tristan. How you doing?
Good, mate. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having us on again, so I can talk more nonsense about our whiskey.
Yeah. Well, as I say, we'll get to that. Don't worry, we're going to get your spot in the limelight there, talking about Nc'nean. But as I alluded to, you were here from day one at Whisky Me, pretty much, and you were before that, in fact, as well on other projects too. What is your kind of first or earliest memories of Whisky Me when it first started?
I can remember the original conversations we had around launching a whiskey subscription business, and I thought you were mental. So, but you were my boss, so I couldn't say anything. But it was sort of like a kind of a daunting project. And then I remember all those early tests with discovering the pouch and finding a viable solution for getting whiskey for a reasonable cost through people's letterboxes, and there really wasn't until these magical little pouches turned up, and and then the stress tests we did on these pouches to ensure they really are as indestructible as as you claim. I think didn't we chuck one out of the top floor of
the office?
The office towers.
Yeah,
it was perfectly fine. Yeah, you got to try really hard to break these.
The office, we threw them at each other quite a lot. And it was just wonderful seeing whiskey fly around the place and yet remain in its packaging, because we'd spent a couple of months, I think, mailing ourselves whiskey with mostly disastrous results. And we ended up with about 5,000 glass bottles that we bought from China that were totally useless. Couldn't do anything with them. It's so fragile. But yeah, for a long time you ran all the social media as well, didn't you? So if anyone has got a spare 5 minutes on the, if you scroll down far enough on Instagram and Whisky Me, you'll see Matt's wonderful work with imagery and the sort of rolling feed there. And there's some really creative stuff we used to do with the social media back then.
Yeah,
still do that.
Of course, yeah. Doing lots of pictures. Learning how to edit video as well. So obviously my background in a previous life before the drinks industry was photography, and I was fairly confident I could build this nice visual story around each of the distilleries that we were featuring. But then we're like, oh, we also want to do video. Can you do video? I was like, wow, don't. It's just 24 photos really quickly every second. I'm sure I can figure it out.
Yeah, because back then we used to go and visit all the distilleries, which was expensive, but an enormous amount of fun. And again, if you look back at some of our past videos on YouTube, the earlier stuff, there's a video for every distillery, and we did about a quarter of distilleries in Scotland probably in that way. And I think we were amongst the first to be granted access to fly drones around them. Well, I say granted permission. Sometimes we were, sometimes we kind of were stretched that the boundaries there. But we had to. I mean, you ended up doing a drone pilot's license just to be able to capture. Didn't you?
Became a registered pilot just so I could fly drones around Scotland. It's great.
It was fun, and you crashed my drone, and it's still never been the same since.
Indeed, I've still got the scars actually on my fingers from where I crashed that drone. I'm sure that distillery's what was it? It's like their little shop at the front, isn't it? I swear there's still bloodstains there where I ran quickly through to bandage my fingers back together.
It was fun. Maybe we should do another episode of this at some point where all we do is just talk about the old stuff. But there's probably people looking for a tasting. So we should kick off with that. Now, the first taste I'm gonna do is gonna be a bit boring for everyone. I'm sorry, but you're gonna need to watch my facial expressions closely, and it could be very interesting for you. This Macallan Fine Oak 12 has been in a pouch for just over 5 years. It was the first whiskey we ever sent out. Speaking of drones, actually, we had a close friend, or still have a close friend, who at the time was working for Macallan, which is obviously one of the most prestigious distilleries in Scotland, if not the most. And they were in the middle of building their all singing, all dancing, sparkly, flashy new distillery building, but the old still house was still working. We were granted access to go in and film in the still house and fly a drone inside the still house. And I was the pilot that day, and it was crazy. We were flying this drone around underneath the line arms of the still. And if you go back and watch the video on YouTube, you'll see exactly the kind of how close we were to these stills, which were on at the time, full of flammable alcohol vapor, as this little mosquito drone thing flew around the place. And I had all sorts of warning signs going off on the controller saying, magnetic interference and all this, because it's basically surrounded by copper. But that was the first whiskey we featured, and we got a slap wrist from Macallan afterwards because they were like, we didn't want you putting our whiskey in pouches. Who let you do this? And our friend at Macallan had left. We got away with it, but it set a precedent because it's like if Macallan can go in a pouch, then anything can go in a pouch. And it was really the best brand we could have started with. But let's see how bad it tastes. And that has not been cracked. I've not dipped into it to taste it at all, to check. It had, by the way, inflated slightly. I don't know if there was air in there beforehand, but it seemed to be like pressurized, which suggests to me some sort of chemical reaction between the inner layer of the pouch and the whiskey.
I was talking to our mutual former Macallan friend the other day, and he reckons that's the last footage ever shot in the old still house. So it really was a couple of weeks before they closed it all down.
Yeah, it was. So color-wise, we were slightly concerned it was going to be like jet black or something, and it looks okay. Now, I'm going to be honest. I won't. I'm not going to try and fool anyone or anything like that. If it smells bad or tastes bad, I will let you know. Okay. Okay. It smells okay. It doesn't smell like plastic.
Does it still smell like Macallan?
It does. I mean, it smells fragrant, and there's fruit there as well, and just a little bit of oak too. Mm. Yeah, it's not quite right on the palate. It's not bad. Because I've stored whiskies in plastic bottles before that have like had quite a lot of air in them, and they've deteriorated after about a year to the point of being disgusting and undrinkable. That is not undrinkable. It has in some way kind of affected the mouthfeel of it. It's slightly flatter. It's almost like it's dropped in ABV, which I don't think it would have done, but it's almost like that. It just feels like it's lost a bit of life. But it's not undrinkable at all. It's just not quite right.
I'll make sure not to keep any of my pouched whiskies around for more than 5 years, and
I'd say
I'm
4
sure
years
will be okay. 4 years, 11 months should be totally fine. Yeah.
Right. Okay, we've done 10 minutes already, and we should probably get on with the Nc'nean. It's lucky that we've sort of filled some of this time with Nc'nean because at the moment we don't have John Rempe to talk about Rebel. He's currently incommunicado and not on the call. So as it stands, Matt and I are going to ramble on about Nc'nean a bit, and then we're both going to talk about Rebel, of which Matt is a complete expert.
Oh yeah, I remember. We did your book tour in America, didn't we? And we spent 7 days at the Rebel Distillery.
We have been to the distillery, because it's Heaven Hill that this is still made at the moment. They've got a new distillery. We'll get onto this in a second. They've got a new distillery which they're producing at, but anything that's currently in bottles is made at Heaven Hill. So we have both been to the distillery.
Oh, we have been to Heaven Hill. Yeah, that was a wonderful experience actually. That's a wicked distillery. Those stills are wild.
Yeah, it's cool. Right, Nc'nean. So just as I think it'd be useful for you to give us sort of an elevator pitch about the distillery. But what I would say is that we have done this conversation before 2 years ago, where you gave an introduction to it and talked about the location and the sort of philosophy of the distillery. And I would advise anyone who's got a single malt subscription to go back 2 years ago. I think it was October 20. It might have been November 20. To rewatch that, because after you've done the elevator pitch, what I'd like to do is shift on and talk a little bit about what's changed since it started and what's new and what's happening and what's different about this whiskey to the one we had before. So, Nc'nean in a nutshell.
Nc'nean in a nutshell, we are comfortably the most sustainable distillery in Scotland, and we're one of the most experimental. They're the sort of the two core pillars for our distillery existing. Annabelle, our founder, her family were looking to get into the whiskey game. They have this beautiful plot of land on the west coast of Scotland. They'd always wondered what they could do with it. Whiskey is always at the forefront of that discussion. So Annabelle took it upon herself. So right, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it exceptionally well. Where's the gap? What is Scotch whiskey missing? So, having explored the depths of Scotch whiskey, I've been to a lot of distilleries, heard a lot of the same chat, which is true. We've both been around Scotland. There is a lot of very similar talk at a lot of distilleries. Nobody's talking about sustainability and the future of Scotch whiskey, and very few people are talking about experimentation, certainly outside of casks. Like if you can mess around with the wood at the end, everyone seems to do that, but no one's ever really talking about barley. No one's talking about fermentation. No one's talking about cut points. Just all the fun things that you can do at the start that make a big impact on flavor, but aren't necessarily the most glamorous and evocative images for big established brands to talk about. So that's what we exist in. I say we're comfortably the most sustainable. There's many sort of levels to that. We're 100% organic, and we only use organic Scottish barley. We're powered 100% by renewable energy, which we now know is one of the things that has changed, has made us net carbon zero on site, and we're carbon neutral field to gate in our supply chain. And we're also bottled in 100% recycled glass, the first whiskey in the world to do that. And that has a massive carbon saving footprint. We do an annual sustainability report, so you can read all of the gory numbers and details. Our latest one will be released, hopefully really soon. We've just finalized it now, so maybe a couple of weeks' time. But generally, like, make it as good as possible for the planet, and then do it in the most experimental way. So we put a big emphasis on yeast experiments and fermentation trials and trying to develop new flavors at those early stages of production. It's more like a beer attitude than it is a whiskey attitude, where you have a lot of like brewers are perpetually talking about their malt and talking about their yeast and how that makes big differences to the flavors of the final finished product. Whereas the story in Scotland for a very long time has always been, we use this yeast strain because it's efficient and it makes traditional flavors. And there's nothing wrong, again, there's nothing wrong with tradition. But with 130 plus distilleries, it always seemed weird that no one was willing to test that. So that's what we do. Sustainable, experimental, delicious Scotch whiskey.
Fantastic. That was a long elevator pitch.
Yeah,
Maybe it was like
the skyscraper.
Yeah. But some really interesting stuff in there. And I think for me, like you say, experimenting and sustainability, I think what you guys are doing is leveraging the sort of two main opportunities of a new distillery. You know, with that sort of carte blanche you have to create your own house style, why not experiment to begin with and see what you want, see what works, see what doesn't, and take everyone along for the ride. And yeah, I mean, honestly, a new business that's not thinking about sustainability in some way, you know, it's probably failing in some way. So yeah, it's pretty awesome to see what you guys are up to. And I we'll get onto this whiskey in a bit, but when I got a bottle through and you guys sent through a bottle, I tasted it, I was like, wow, this is getting better. Like, not just older, but like this spirit's starting to mature in terms of its character. And you can see it evolving in that way. And I think it's tasting really good at the moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just, can we just touch on this net zero? Because a lot of people might be thinking, how the hell can a distillery be net zero? Like, it requires a lot of heat, which is obviously energy, and you know, moving stuff around, and you know, where does that energy come from? Okay, cool, you get like, I don't know, wind powered or sustainable electricity, but what about heating stills, all that sort of stuff? So talk us through it.
So your net zero status, ours is for scopes 1 and 2. So every business is measured on 3 scopes, and scope 3 is all the sort of stuff outside of your own influence. So your supply chain and your suppliers. Scopes 1 and 2, which are the things that we're net zero for. Net zero being a sort of like an elevated version of carbon neutral. I'd say carbon neutral is you've measured your impact on the planet and you've offset accordingly. Net zero, you need to measure your impact on the planet. You need to reduce every possible output that you can to as close to zero as possible, and then you offset what's remaining, but you also offset it in a very good way. It's not sort of buying standard carbon credits. It needs to be like an actual carbon removal scheme. So we use a tree replanting scheme for our carbon credits for what we have remaining for our figure. But in the last sustainability report, I think our CO2 emissions per year, it's about 24 tons or something in that ballpark, 20 something tons of CO2 per year, which is the equivalent of a single return commercial flight from London to New York. So our entire operation for an entire year. And it's because everything at our company goes through this veil of, can we do this in a better way for the planet? And if we can, then we do. And we do have the luxury of being a relatively young and new business. So if we wanted to implement these things, they're there from the start. We're not trying to tear out old equipment and retrofit and green things in. It's been green since the beginning. So the main thing is the power source for the still. That's the majority of energy consumption for any distillery in Scotland. We use a biomass boiler. So everything for Nc'nean, sort of working with what you have. We have this beautiful plot of land on the west coast on the Morven Peninsula. The family have a commercial forest that is attached to the side of that plot of land. So that side of the business operates as a commercial sustainable forestry, and then we take the wood from that, replanting the trees, and then use that in the biomass boiler. The emissions from a biomass boiler versus the norm in Scotland, which is fossil fuels, it's gas and oil, it's about an 80% reduction in CO2 emissions. And then obviously your fuel source is renewable in perpetuity, because we can always use that land to plant more trees. We're currently planting more trees than we cut down as well because of some silly things. But yeah, the general gist is look after what you have and then maintain it.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but there's this thing where you're reducing carbon by cutting down an old tree and planting a new one, right? Because new ones, they sequester more carbon than old ones. Old ones are lazy. New ones are virile and want all that CO2. And so by cutting down and replanting, you're actually sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere.
Yeah, it's sort of like the relative difference between growth. Like a young tree grows a lot more than an old tree, and that growth is the storage of carbon. It's the same with like natural cork. That's why natural cork is such a good environmental solution for closures on bottles, because it's just bark that grows on a very particular kind of oak tree in Portugal. But you harvest it every 7-9 years, and then it starts growing more bark again because it's lost all its bark. Like, it's a really good way of sequestering carbon and then having a really useful product at the end of it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit about the whiskey itself then. How has you've done a lot of releases over the last 2 years? Like, you can go on your website and see all the different batch numbers. There's been a lot. So how does that process, how does that work? How has it evolved? How has the sort of flavor of the whiskey changed, and the cask mixture and so on?
Okay. So in my head, we have kind of 4 releases. This is one of them we do a lot, and it was more down to practicality than anything. The blending tank we were previously using could hold about 5,000 bottles, and we were selling through about 5,000 bottles very, very quickly. So anything, if you look at a bottle of Nc'nean and it says batch 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 18, it's the same recipe. If I'm doing my job properly as a blender, theoretically tastes the same or at least very similar. And the goal was to create this consistent, light, fruity, easy drinking whiskey, very creamy whiskey. That recipe and the new recipe aren't colossally different. There's a small shift, and it's almost like a little evolution. Previously, we were using 65% STR red wine casks, so reconditioned Spanish Portuguese red wine casks that add these kind of like bready, herbal, jammy fruits, yumminess, and then 35% American whiskey casks, predominantly first fill ex-bourbon, but there might be the odd kind of second fill American whiskey cask that we throw in there as well. They're much more distillery profile, so we do get the vanillas and the coconuts and the bits that you'd expect from a bourbon cask, but it's also just very clean, citrusy, bright, chewy. The new recipe, so this, I'm really proud of this. I'm obviously going to be, but it's the first chance that I've had to have a proper stamp on what our core expression is. So previously I was blending, I've blended everything that Nc'nean have ever released, but this was, someone had told me the recipe basically. We've done a bit of work together, but it's like, right, here's what you're working to. Can you make this consistently?
Yeah.
This is the first time where they've said, right, here's the keys to the warehouse. We're looking at changing the batch size because we now got a big blending tank. This seems like a really good idea and a really good time to look at evaluating the recipe that we have for the core expression. And if there's any tweaks and changes that you might need or want to make. The big thing is that about 7% of our warehouse is sherry butts, big 500-litre Oloroso sherry casks. And the intent was always to incorporate them at some point. It's just that when we first launched the whiskey at 3 years old, they weren't ready. They weren't in a good enough place for us to consider using them. Now they're utterly delicious. Sort of 5 years old, the ones that we're using, they are everything that I want from a big sherry cask. And they're really fun to blend with because they don't play nicely. They're wonderful on their own, and they're wonderful in really small doses as like a little salt and pepper seasoning for your whiskey. And anything in between is borderline undrinkable, which is a really fun thing to figure out. Because we're like, oh, there's 7% in the warehouse. Let's just use 7% in the recipe and see what happens. No, don't ever do that. So the new recipe, we've reduced the STR red wine component a little bit. It's 55% rather than 65 now. The bourbon correspondingly has gone up, so it's 43% now instead of 35. And then the last 2% are those sherry butts. And it is just that little bit of kind of seasoning that brings everything together, a little bit more depth, a little bit more rich fruitiness. It's not a colossal shift away from what Nc'nean was previously, but it is that kind of next step to a more consistent house style that we're going to continue with, it certainly for the next few years.
When you're on the road doing tastings, do you taste those separate components individually with bars and shops and whatever who are selling the whiskey?
Depending on the clientele, but yeah, I try and bring along as much as I can. I'm very lucky to have access to lots of these fun things, so it's always nice to share. One of the things I do like bringing along is our new make. It's really fun just letting people taste new make so they can understand the whiskey journey a little bit better. There's lots of venues that you go into and they don't sort of understand that whiskey when it starts life is clear. It's a very different spirit and proposition to what you get in your glass as an aged whiskey. So you get that kind of visual confirmation that there's going to be change, and then the taste as well, because they're so drastically different. Our new make is so kind of vibrant and floral and fresh, and it's still got that kind of waxy, chewy, creamy quality. So it's a fun spirit to taste on its own. It's part of the setup of Nc'nean is building a great spirit that needs a little bit of time in wood, rather than making as much spirit as possible and then letting wood do all the work afterwards. I kind of, in my head, I always see it as like moving your angel share early. So we make bigger cuts. We cut more liquid from the still. We use slightly inefficient yeast to get the flavors that we want, but it's ultimately about building a really high quality spirit that then gets finished off in wood, rather than a spirit that needs wood.
Yeah.
It's fun to let people taste those kind of things.
Sure. So, actually, I've got two questions here. So, firstly, are you still sort of messing about with different? I say messing about. You still experimenting and trialing different yeasts and different types of like production flows as well. And is that something that's just ongoing? Like you want to create diversity in the new make and then fill, different liquids?
Well, we just want to try lots of different things. We were given a sort of yeast recipe by the legendary Dr. Jim Swan as our consultant distiller before we started, and he was always of the opinion of like, no, this is the good yeast recipe, just use this. But Annabelle is inherently inquisitive and wanted to try different things. So every year we dedicate about 10% of our annual production, so it's around 3 weeks of actual production time, to yeast experiments. So rather than pitching the two yeasts that we currently use to make the beer before we make the spirit, in this case it will be pitching two, but one of them will be swapped out, or maybe three yeasts, depending on whatever's worked best in kind of bucket trials. We still need the yield to a certain degree, but it's also what's interesting flavor wise. The first couple of years, I'd say they were relatively traditional, commercially available yeasts, just to see what would happen. So we tried some Chardonnay yeast, some Champagne yeast, some different red wine yeasts, some rum yeast, which we released earlier this year. The Huntress is the first of those yeast experiments to see the commercial light of day. Since I've joined the company, we've done quite a bit on different beer yeasts. So we've tried some Saison, a Kveik, which is wicked. It's like a Norwegian alehouse yeast. It's fast fermenting, super tropical fruity, super waxy creamy. If you've ever had Robinson's orange barley squash, the wash tastes exactly like that. Really, really disconcertingly creamy barley orange, but it's delicious. We've also done some trials with another company called Spheric Spirits on a Pachia yeast, which I can't remember the full details of why it's different, but it is exceptionally different as a spirit. And we've tasted some of the spirit now from casks that's about 2 years old, and it's got this wild kind of cola cube flavor, and they're exceptionally fatty and soft. And that's going to be a really interesting release when we can legally call it whiskey and release it.
I don't even know what that is. Is that a Vosk Vet?
Kveik. So Kveik's a yeast. I can't remember the specific one that we chose. It will be something that's sort of relatively easily commercially available, because we still need to function. The Pachia wasn't commercially available. So we had some poor intern from Spheric Spirits come up to the West Coast for a week and trying desperately to keep the yeast alive while we were using it, which was funny. To answer David's question that's up on the screen there, we have not, and we never will, consider making a peated batch of Nc'nean. It goes very much against the sustainability credentials of our distillery, cutting up a natural carbon sink and burning it to make your whiskey taste a bit smoky. I understand its history and its heritage, and I personally love peated whiskey. I think it's delicious, but there's no way we could justify doing a peated batch.
Fair point. Yeah. Everyone's peated whiskey just tasted a little bit shitter then. The environmentalists are coming after your peat, unfortunately, I'm afraid. But yeah, it's a good point. It's a hot topic at the moment as well, to do with preserving peat bogs. But that's for another episode. So so batch BU06, sexy title.
BU06.
What? So let's taste it. In fact, I've been tasting it for the last hour or so. Let's get involved in it. I've got some tasting notes to share with you from a couple of people already as well.
Lovely.
Oh, here's another question while we just nose it. That's okay. Nc'nean going ahead with a bottle return scheme to increase recycling. Is that something you can do?
Yeah, it's one of those hard things for the SWA. For like a bottle return scheme, it's currently difficult from a different environmental point of view. It's not particularly environmental friendly sending empty bottles to the west coast of Scotland, especially in like individual delivery runs. We are looking at kind of having like a centralized solution for that, but it gets very difficult with the bottling laws, specifically around single malt Scotch whisky. One of the things that we have implemented now is we do a refill scheme at the distillery. So if you do ever want to come to the West Coast and you're making that trip, you can bring an empty Nc'nean bottle along, and you get a heavily discounted bottle of whiskey from the lovely Amy in our shop, who will refill your bottle and relabel the duty sticker and all that fun legal stuff. But an actual return scheme is really difficult. Yeah, we'd love
I like that.
We'd love to have like a sort of a nationwide refill scheme. There's loads of things that other distilleries are doing and can do because they don't follow the same very strict rules that the Scotch Whisky Association enforce upon us. So I've been into a few different bottle shops where you can sort of like refill the local gin, and I'd love to do that. That would be great if we could like roll that out and have refill centers around some of our like favorite retailers and bars across the country. But the laws on bottling single malt Scotch whisky are very restrictive as to what you can and can't do. Mostly what you can't do.
Yeah, I mean, you have to kind of, I guess, add up the carbon cost of putting glass through your household recycling flow, and obviously the way in which that is collected en masse and transported to a central location, and then powdered down and turned into new glass, which you are then using with whatever system you might be able to set up for your own distillery to get bottles back. And it does strike me, as you say, that is likely to be more carbon intensive than just going through the current recycling flow, basically.
Yeah, that's pretty much what we've come to. We have looked at sort of other refill things. There's something that we are doing currently for a foreign market that I'm not allowed to talk about, but because their recycling is substantially better than the UK's, we can justify releasing the whiskey that way, which I'm very excited to get out in the world, because that will heavily reduce the kind of the carbon footprint associated with getting whiskey on shelves and getting whiskey out into the world, and should suitably piss off enough people to cause a bit of a buzz.
Cool. So this whiskey, so I remember when we tasted the first one, and I think I've probably had, I've drunk Nc'nean a few times since then, not entirely sure what batch number or anything like that I've had, but I do remember the first, and for me, it was like strawberries and cream. It had this wonderful, sweet, floral, fruity kind of red fruit note, I guess coming from largely, or a lot of it coming from your red wine casks. And it was delicious, like really nice, very elegant. This is a change, and I think a good change. For me, there's much more spice to it. I don't mean like heat, I mean sort of fizzling, nutty baking spice, whether it's ginger or clove or nutmeg, all that kind of stuff coming through. And it really gives the whiskey some structure, I think, and works really, really well.
Yeah. A lot of that is the STRs really coming to the fore. Their life cycle as you're tasting them, like 3-year-old STR casks, are lovely and vibrant and fruity and fresh. And they have that kind of a little bit of bready spice, but it's quite green. So I associate with things like caraway and eucalyptus and menthol. And as we're getting now to, I mean, admittedly, this batch will be a mixture of 3, 4, and 5-year-old, but those 5-year-old STR casks are much deeper and more herbal and thick and rich. And they do add those kind of like gingery, root spice and nuttiness. So there's a bit of that. Obviously, the inclusion of the sherry component, even though it's only 2%, it is very noticeable, because it does just add a little bit more depth in the fruit for me. But it still tastes like Nc'nean. The big thing for us is the profile of the spirit and that fattiness, that kind of texture and viscosity. It's why we bottle at 46% and why we don't chill filter, because it's so fundamental to the experience of the whiskey. Like those oily components don't taste of anything in themselves, but they affect how everything else tastes and how it coats your tongue and how it elongates the finish. For I mean, what's a very light style whiskey would have an exceptionally long finish, in my opinion, just because those fats are stuck to your tongue.
With these like much talked about sherry casks, which kind of either you need to use in a tiny amount or massive amount, are we ever likely to see a single cask sherry release or a batched sherry release, 100% sherry cask?
I don't know if we'll do well, we have done a single cask of a sherry hogshead that we had. So it's not of the sherry cask that we currently use, the smaller 2.25 litre casks, but that was only released in Germany and it sold out like hotcakes. And the majority of the comments we get from Germany, people complaining because they couldn't get hold of a bottle. But that, in tasting that, I didn't taste very Nc'nean. It was delicious, just not very Nc'nean, not very our profile. Still unbelievably, like just jammy, fruity, creamy, thick yumminess. But slightly different for these big sherry butts. I don't know if we have enough to justify using them for single cask release when we need them for the core. I would like to, but it's kind of in the balance as to how much liquid we have. The way that we might get more of a sherry influence will be the next Quiet Rebels release. So every year we do a Quiet Rebels release in the autumn. The first year was Annabelle, and there was Bourbon and Tokai casks. The second year was Lorna, who is our main distiller, and she's got a big sweet tooth. So that was Bourbon and Pinot de Chiron casks. Both of those were quite light and more distillery profile characteristics. The next person in line for a Quiet Rebels release is Gordon, who's our distillery manager, and Gordon is a sherry fiend. He loves big, heavy, meaty, thick, sulfurous drams. So trying to find a way of creating that with Nc'nean is going to be really difficult, but really good fun. So I imagine I'll be incorporating a fair amount of sherry into that. I imagine there'll be a higher percentage of STR probably. I've just taken in two rum casks from Two Drifters, who are a sustainable rum producer based down in Devon. They take the molasses from Tate and Lyle and turn it into utterly delicious Devonshire rum. Sorry to talk about a competing county next to you, Tristan. But they have these ex-masala casks that they then use for their rum, and then we've taken those ex-masala, ex-rum casks up to our distillery, and they're very salinous and they're very vegetal at the same time. So I might start incorporate some of those as well for a bit of seasoning.
Oh, rum cask, nice. Cool. Look, there's some tasting notes for you, which I can get on board with as well. Caribbean spice, creamy vanilla on the nose. Speaking of rum.
Speaking of rum, we're gonna have to pour some more.
Here's a compliment. Again, I can get on board with. Given a bottle of Nc'nean for Christmas a couple of years ago and enjoyed it. This expression is really great. Definitely even better. Not missing the peat, enjoying that spice. Sludge. Yeah.
That's right.
That's how I'd summarize this tasting, in fact. Well done, Phil.
Yeah,
oh,
I love people upcycling the bottles.
We don't have to recycle the bottles. We can turn them into beautiful lights.
Yeah.
People are probably saying right now, Tristan could do with a beautiful light in his room. Why is it so dark?
We've just started selling wax candles on our website. We've got these lovely beeswax candles that are made in the UK, specifically to encourage people to upcycle their bottles and to turn them into something beautiful after they've used them.
Nice. Right, cool. Well, look, we've done 40 minutes on us reminiscing about Whisky Me and talking about Nc'nean, and we still don't have John from Rebel. So I'm afraid, Matt, that it's down to me and you to taste this bourbon and to give our opinions on it.
And become the Rebel brand ambassador.
We are the Rebel Rebels in a way.
The Rebel Rebels, yeah.
The Rebel Rebels. We do not work for them, but it's bourbon and we'll taste it. So allow me to give you a little bit of information about the brand if you don't already know it. So it's currently owned by Luxco. And Luxco are sort of a big distillery brand out in the US now. They've got a number of brands under their belt, Yellowstone being another one, Ezra Brooks, and a few others. They have just built a distillery in Bardstown, which is kind of the spiritual home of Kentucky whiskey. It's where Jim Beam are. It's where the Distillers Row is, and where all the sort of big family names of Kentucky whiskey are from. You and I have both been there. We have visited these distilleries when I was writing my American whiskey book, and they own Rebel Bourbon. Now, the distillery's only been going since 2018. It's a brand new operation. If you go on the Whisky Me website, you can read the blog post and see some of the images about it. It's a very new operation. In fact, I think, when were we there last? Was it about 4 years ago? I don't think they'd finished building it, or if they had, it had only just launched. It would have been 5 years ago.
4 or 5 years ago, yeah.
So
but yeah, we definitely didn't go. I'd remember, because that's a very pretty looking distillery on the little card you sent out to us.
Yeah. So it's new, and it's so new, in fact, that they're making Rebel Bourbon, but it's not the bourbon that we're getting in this bottle. And I have heard on good authority, and there's no one here to challenge me on this, because here we are. That this whiskey that's in this bottle and in your pouches was made at Heaven Hill, which is hardly surprising, because Heaven Hill make dozens of different whiskey brands for different people. They are really the the sort of go-to guys in Kentucky for producing bourbon whiskey, and lots of different brands made there, and lots of different recipes. They're not just making the same bourbon whiskey over and over again. They're using different mash profiles, different fermentation times, and then perhaps different maturation profiles too, and different lengths of time. And obviously, whiskey is bottled at different strengths as well. Now, the interesting thing about Rebel is that it's a wheated whiskey. And when we talk about bourbon, we're talking about a product that's predominantly corn-based. And legally, it has to be a minimum of 51% corn that's used in the mash. But the other cereals are usually comprised of malted barley, and then either rye or wheat. And rye tends to add spice and nuttiness, bit of heat, whereas wheat is softer. When we talk about wheat spirits, we tend to talk about more sort of citrusy, lighter, fresher. You think about like Hoegaarden or any other wheat beer, you're thinking of these sort of lemony, light, very kind of placid almost characteristics, which can be quite nice in a bourbon because it sort of smooths things over. And there's a long history of wheated whiskey and bourbon going right back to the 1850s. So around 1851, the Stitzel Wellers distillery was built, and they were the ones that pioneered using wheat in whiskey. Do we know percentages of wheat and barley in this? I believe it's around 5% malted barley and 12% wheat, the remainder being corn. You are testing me now, though. It might well have mentioned it in the blog post, so do check that. So Stitzel Weller were the ones that pioneered wheated whiskey, and they made a really great name for it. So when you look at brands like Weller and Pappy Van Winkle, which is probably the most prestigious and most famous of all the wheat whiskies or wheated bourbons, that's where it all came from. And Rebel will tell you that their recipe sort of came from that, it passed down, and indeed the ownership of those recipes did kind of carry on through right into the 1950s when Rebel Yell bourbon was first launched. And for it, some of you may kind of be like, oh, Rebel bourbon, that sounds familiar. I've not had it before. This is in fact a rebranding of Rebel Yell. But Luxco don't like to talk about the old name too much because it has certain negative connotations that they'd rather leave behind, which in fact they are leaving behind, and hence the name of the brand name. If you want to find out more about that, then you're welcome to Google, but I'm going to be nice and not kind of highlight it on this particular tasting, because I no doubt someone from Luxco or the importers will be watching this at some point, and it's not necessarily the talking point that they want. But the brand launched in the 1950s, and again, the blog post goes into a bit of detail about this, but it was a collaboration between the distillery, Cecil Weller, and the mayor of Louisville, Louisville being kind of the main city there in Kentucky. And they were quite fortunate in that it became a sort of cult icon of a whiskey, largely down to the Rolling Stones, because Keith Richards used to not just drink Rebel Yell bourbon, but drink a lot of it and publicize the fact that he was drinking it, as Keith Richards does. So yeah, if you Google Rebel Yell Rolling Stones, you'll see lots and lots of pictures of Keith Richards holding a bottle, or drinking straight out of a bottle, or passing a bottle to someone, which is pretty cool. And then Billy Idol, the other singer rock star, actually named a song and album after this bourbon round, having spent a night drinking with Keith Richards and enjoying Rebel Yell. So it's one of the few whiskey brands that has a song and an album named after it. I can't think of many, and even the big ones like Jim Beam and Jack Daniels, I'm not sure they can claim that, or at least not claim that an artist as big as that, coined the term or chose the name. So that's your sort of potted history from someone who's done a little bit of research, but it is not working for the brand. Funny questions, then that's pretty much the extent of it. So don't ask them, but I can try and answer them. But we should taste it. Matt, you've got a pouch. What do you think? You've been sniffing it and sipping it.
I've had a wee sip. It's delicious. I love wheated bourbons. They are my favorite. There's a very famous other brand that I'm not going to mention for nice reasons, but it's my sort of go-to American whiskey. I adore it. This is wicked. On the nose, it doesn't come across as a wheated bourbon to me. I think it's got quite a heavy licoricey component that I normally associate with rye heavy whiskies, rye heavy bourbons.
Yeah,
and ryes. On the palate, it's got that wheat element in that. It's just kind of just that extra element of like butteriness, and it is very specifically like diacetyl butter flavor, like the thing that makes butter taste like butter. It's that. Which is just yummy.
Yeah,
and then it's also it's kind of like a little bit of smoke, but it is very much like a wood cask kind of smoke, like a char kind of smoke, which is really endearing because it's just kind of like sweet and yeah, yum.
I think it's good at 100 proof. I think wheated bourbons at lower strength, for me anyway, for my taste, can sometimes be a bit too soft.
Flabby.
Flabby and just lack the guts. And you can bottle rye bourbons at that strength, I think, and you're fine. And as soon as you start getting above 100 proof of rye, it can be quite challenging for some people. Not me. Probably not you either. But I think with wheated, it's good to have that sort of backdrop of alcohol, because it just gives it a little bit of length and heat to challenge some of that otherwise quite sort of oily, popcorny, wheaty kind of softness,
Yeah, popcorn's a really good shout, and it's very much like the oils in a big popcorn machine, like the container that's been running for a week straight, and it's got that kind of residual, really sweet, chewy gunk. It's got a bit of that. Yeah, it's yum.
Yeah, it's cool. What's your favorite bourbon cocktail? How do you like to drink it?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I don't have many bourbon cocktails normally.
Surely a Manhattan, come on.
I like it with rye. Like loads of these drinks, I'm like, I just prefer it with rye. I do like a brown derby.
Oh yeah,
the little grapefruit and honey thing. And I actually thinking about it, one of my go-to drinks that I never really associate with bourbon, but it is obviously a bourbon drink, a Gold Rush. I love a Gold Rush, and they're both basically the same drink. It's just whiskey, something sour, and a bit of honey. But I think a Gold Rush is a really
A whiskey sour with bourbon, I think, is fantastic. Like I think it trumps Scotch for me in terms of sour. And as you say, some kind of modifier in it, whether it's a little bit of red wine or a bit of honey instead of sugar or something or other, is really interesting in there. And no doubt you could probably put like virtually any liqueur in there or any kind of sweetened syrup, and it would kind of do something interesting with bourbon. It seems like it's probably, I think bourbon, ooh, I don't know, maybe I'm treading on dangerous territory here. I was going to say bourbon is inherently slightly more mixable than Scotch. And I think it probably is a bit more forgiving. I think, and it may be because, and again, dangerous territory, bourbon is slightly more standardized in its flavor due to the regulations and the way it needs to be produced and new oak and everything. Whereas Scotch, a bit more diversity to it. And I think probably the cocktails that have been designed for bourbon whiskey have reflected that you know, that quite specific style of whiskey that it is.
They're quite flexible. As a spirit. Yeah, you can really mess with the specs of a bourbon cocktail and not make too much difference. Or you can have something that's really delicious at one end and really delicious at the other end. Whereas Scotch, I think Scotch makes unbelievably delicious cocktails, but it is a bit more pernicious. You've got to be very kind of balanced and careful and find the right level, especially when you start incorporating peat, because it can very quickly overwhelm for the wrong reasons. Having said that, one of my favorite cocktails is the most egregiously smoky, over the top thing. It's in Brad Thomas Parsons' Bitters cocktail book. It's called a Black Scottish Cyclops, and it's named after a video game character from Team Fortress 2, like an online shooter, where there's this big big black Scottish Cyclops who is like a demolition expert. But it's Lafroig with Ramazzotti and the Fee Brothers whiskey barrel aged bitters. So it's like intense. But it makes this really big, beautiful cocktail.
Yeah, that does sound full on, like proper assault. going to war against your tongue and nose. Yeah. Right, we've got a few little tasting notes coming through here. Let's see what we got. Nutty oak smoke on the. I mean, you do get that kind of. It's funny. Obviously, there's no peat involved in this or any smoking in any sense, but that heavy char that you get on new American oak barrels, it does carry through some of the smoke of that fire. You know.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very approachable smoke. Like it's obviously with peat, it can be in all kinds of range, but it's predominantly very kind of medicinal and very sort of Marmite in its characteristics. Whereas this is a lot more kind of marshmallows on a campfire. Just a lot. There are very few people that aren't going to enjoy that kind of smoke.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like barbecue. If you don't like the flavor of barbecue food, then like what happened to you?
What kind of horrific barbecue accident did you have as a child?
Yeah, I mean, you must have had a lot of sausages and subsequent food poisoning to train yourself to dislike that, you know, or maybe too much bourbon, possibly. So, well, look, this is ironically, I think this is the longest tasting we've ever done. We're closing in an hour, and only 50% of the guests turned up. But Matt, that is a testament to your skill as an orator and brand ambassador, and as a stand-in rebel ambassador.
Well, we are the quiet rebels, changing Scotch whiskey. So there's some like.
Yeah, exactly. This is it. I can see the synergy there. So, but thank you for coming on and doing this, and thanks for celebrating 5 years with us. And thank you everyone that ran for the whole tasting. There's still a couple of dozen of you hanging in there. Do appreciate it, and well, we'll see you next time. Thanks again, Matt.
Thank you, Tris. Congrats on 5 years, and long may it continue.
Yeah, Sanj.
As well.